Yeah, Steve says I've been in post since earlier this year, and I'm going to just share my screen with you so we can take a look at some pine marten. Okay, here we go. So hopefully you've all got a cute little pine marten up on the screen there. Yeah, so I'm going to do a little bit about pine martens, a bit about ecology. I'm aware that probably some of you have heard some of our talks before and may have heard some of that, but equally some of you may not have done. But I'm quite keen just to give you a bit of an update on where we are with the project, and also what we've got coming up as well, and some of the sort of findings out of some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. So just to really say that the Two Moors Pine Marten project is a collaboration between the National Trust, Woodland Trust, and the two national park authorities, with Devon Wildlife Trust as the lead partner. We also have supporting partners in Forestry England and Somerset Wildlife Trust, and obviously it's statutory bodies, Natural England, Nature Stop. We can't do this without them. And the goal really of this collaboration is to look at the feasibility of whether it's appropriate and suitable to bring pine martens back to the southwest, and if it is, then to look at bringing back this species to form a sustainable, thriving population that ultimately will link to other projects in Wales and Gloucestershire. So that's who we are. So what are pine martens? I'm hoping that most of you know what a pine marten is. I suspect that a lot of you may not have seen one, a wild one at least, before. This is the European pine martens. They're mustelids in the same group as badgers, stoats, weasels, otters, and the like in Britain. If we have a sort of little skip over the channel, another close related species is the stone or beech marten, just to sort of give you an idea that there are a few of these kind of animals out there, very similar but has a white bib and slightly different ecology and appearance. I think it's quite interesting to think we call them pine martens, but actually they've been called marten cats, tree cats, in various dialects across the UK in the past. So obviously a strong association with trees, and possibly the pine element of it may come from Scotland and potentially other European countries where they might be associated with some of the native pine forests there as well. So in case you haven't seen one before, hopefully you can see this video and get a bit of a feel for what they look like in the wild. So this kind of habitat here is a really good example of the kind of place where you expect to see pine martens and where pine martens do well. It's a very kind of structurally diverse piece of woodland, lots of upturned tree roots, understory and tree canopy, you know, lots of places for them to hunt, forage and den. So here's a little bit of a clearer picture of some of the sort of features of pine marten. I think this one's quite good because it really shows their kind of creamy bib, which they have quite individual markings. So they've got kind of this nice chocolate kind of coat with a creamy bib. And if you can manage to get good photographs like this one, you can often identify individuals, which is can be very useful when you're trying to kind of work out where certain animals are going, what they're doing. These are native species. They've been on in Britain since the last ice age, and at one time were thought to be our second most common carnivore. So you see things have changed somewhat since then. So habitat-wise, very associated with woodland, as I mentioned, broadleaf and coniferous. So we do see that even in some of the sort of coniferous plantations as well. They're excellent climbers. They're very arboreal, happy up in trees. And in fact, one of their main predator avoidance strategies is to head up a tree. So they can be predated by foxes and birds of prey and things as well. But they also are found in scrubby habitat and rocky crags and things. And they den within sort of tree cavities, but also amongst kind of some of these rocky outcrops as well. They're sort of have very large home ranges, so that can vary enormously depending on habitat, and that can be between 1 and 10 square kilometres, with the largest recorded in Scotland of about 56 kilometres squared. So imagine that's an awful lot of travelling around that those pine martens are doing to secure that territory. They are very territorial. In fact, they're largely solitary animals, and they maintain strict territories, especially the males. Female and male territories will overlap, but the only time we really come together is to mate, which is sort of towards the end of the summer. The females have what we call delayed implantation, so the embryos don't actually develop until the following spring, and then they'll have somewhere between 1 and 5 kits, but normally between 1 and 3 the following sort of spring, March and April time. And they stay with the mother for quite some time, sort of over that following autumn and winter time. They don't breed until they're around 3, and they can be quite long-lived, sort of up to 12 years. So their whole kind of strategy is, you know, slow breeders, long lifespans, and that can mean that they're potentially quite vulnerable to sort of losses of individuals. Populations can be quite quickly affected by that. It takes them a long time to recover. So I'll mention a bit about their diet. So I'm sorry if I'm recapping for some of you that know this already, but I think it's quite useful when we think about their sort of place in a woodland ecosystem as well, to think about what they eat and their roles that they play. So small mammals are a really important part of their diet. So field voles particularly, but also bank voles with mice, and grey squirrels, which I'm a picture of there, and we'll come back to those in a minute. Interestingly, fruit plays a really important part of their diet. Obviously that's quite seasonal, so they'll be looking at that at this time of year. And lots of dietary studies that have been done across Europe have shown that fruit can be sort of up to 20%, or sometimes much more than that in their diet. So it's really important. And when we think about them in that woodland ecosystem, they're really important seed dispersers. So if you think about those really big territories, they're travelling across the landscape, spreading sort of seeds. And when we're thinking about woodland restoration and trying to get more woodland cover, obviously being able to transport seed across wide areas is really important, and that includes all the ground cover. So it's not just the trees, but here we've got some bilberry there, which is one of their favourite fruits. They also will take birds and lay eggs and nests in springtime. Invertebrates are another item that they will take. The main thing I think to sort of realise is they're enormously flexible. So what they're going for is what's common in the landscape, what's really abundant. They're not particularly choosy in terms of going and hunting out specific things, apart from possibly field voles, which does seem to be a preferred item. But they will take what they come across and what's easy to catch. So they're not dedicated, say, bird hunters or whatever. So they're very opportunist, quite lazy, really, just picking out what's available. Carrions, another high value sort of food item. So if there's sort of carcasses of deer and things in the environments, they will go for those. So their kind of role in that woodland ecosystem, I mentioned about seed dispersal, but also with other predators as well. So sometimes can be nervous about thinking about predators in the environment, but actually most things out there are predators to some extent or another. And interactions between predators, like competition or even predation, or avoiding strategies in terms of their sort of space. So things like corvids, grey squirrels, even foxes, reduces the reliance on certain prey and targeting of certain species of any one of those predators. So they have this sort of balancing effect. And the more of these different species there are in the environment, the more kind of balanced and strong that is, the more complex it is. complex environments or complex systems are much more resilient, and having more species diversity and more of these kind of these really vital processes like predation and decomposition and disturbance are really important in that. So, little snapshot of their diet. I will mention the grey squirrel. It comes up a lot in our discussions with people generally when we're talking about pine martens. I'm sure that you're aware of the huge damage that these non-native North American grey squirrels cause since they were introduced within the UK. They sort of bark, strip and damage trees, and there's a monetary cost to that in terms of forestry, but there's also a big kind of biodiversity cost as well, with losing potential for trees to get big and old and develop all the kind of characteristics that support a lot of biodiversity. The other thing, as I'm sure you know, is the impact they've had on our native red squirrels, and that's through competition, but also through spreading of diseases that our red squirrels have new resistance to. So I'm just going to mention some research, started off with anecdotal observations really, that in Ireland over the last sort of 15 years or whatever, people were noticing that pine martens, which had been greatly reduced in number, were starting to appear again, and they also noticed that grey squirrels were disappearing. And on the back of that, people were starting to see red squirrels reappearing in places where they hadn't seen them for a very long time. So there's lots of research followed this, and in fact there's a lot more happening in Scotland to really unpick this. And it appears that there's a sort of two-pronged effect there. Pine martens do predate grey squirrels, but they also create a sort of landscape of fear as well. So grey squirrels haven't co-evolved with pine marten. They don't understand how they should respond. They don't know that they have to run away when there's a pine marten. They know that there's a predator there, and that stress can reduce kind of survival and numbers of offspring and things. So they have a sort of definite impact on them, and we're seeing these similar patterns across Scotland. So much as we kind of may like to see grey squirrels in our parks and gardens, in our sort of wider landscape, certainly amongst sort of foresters, are very conscious of the sort of devastating effects that they've caused and the impact that that can have on the targets we have for recovering our woodland. So we're sort of counter that. We don't really know the full story, but there's certainly some interesting research that looks at how that could, the sort of pine marten recovery can possibly be a bit of a solution to our grey squirrel problem. We'll wait and see. So if I'm just going to skip through a little bit of our history in Britain in terms of pine martens. So if we can see sort of history in not really that long ago, the end of the 1800s, we can see quite a bad kind of situation there. So pine marten was rare across most of its sort of British range there, and by the early 1900s, it's pretty much gone and restricted to those very tiny portions where up in the northwest Scotland and the lakes and the like. So if we jump forward a little bit to now, so this map is from the National Strategy, which I'll come on to in a second. And the yellow kind of part of that map was that kind of restricted distribution that it had. But if we look at more recent times, we can see the green areas are where it's actually recovered to, and that includes. You have a look at the Welsh area there, you can see we've got quite a big patch of green, and also the Forest of Dean, and those two areas are where we've had recent reintroduction projects, and both of those have been very successful. So we've seen dispersal of animals and also breeding and things. So we've got some really good track records of other projects that have carried out reintroductions and been very successful. However, it's still particularly endangered in England and Wales with very low populations. And we have to remember that that Scottish population, although it looks a bit of a blanket coverage, is very much a recovering population. So it's nowhere near the state that it would have been even sort of 200 years ago. So main sort of decline, habitat loss. So as we have cleared woodland from our country over the decades, that would have impacted, you know, many woodland species really, and pine marten is one of those. You can see that in the general downward trend. We have got a little tick up at the ends there. And that picture looks very similar to Devon, which historically has been quite a, well, it's one of the less wooded counties historically. But again, it's had some recovery of that woodland cover. But what we do have in Devon is we have very rich hedgerow systems still. We haven't lost quite as much of our hedgerows as other parts of the country. And we've got lots of copses and sort of small areas of woodland that are connected, as well as some larger areas. So these are all sort of positive things. So the other unfortunate main reason for the more recent decline really is persecution. And hunting for fur. So over the 18th and 19th century, the population really declined due to those. And it's likely it became extinct in the southwest around late 1800s. So the sort of decline, that latter decline in the late sort of 1890s really coincided with the rise of sporting estates. Whereby predators or vermin such as pine marten, but actually a whole range of other stuff as well. So including wildcats, but and many birds of prey as well were targeted and eradicated completely in some circumstances. Unfortunately, trapping still occurs. It is illegal. They are protected now. But sometimes they're caught accidentally. So unfortunately, it's still an issue. And it's something as a project we need to be really aware of. It's potentially a risk to our project. So it's something that we're kind of, you know, obviously wary of. So there has been this recovery. And if we look at the kind of main reasons for that, so legal protections, I've mentioned there, they are protected. Back in the 80s, and then there's been other legal protection up in Scotland that have allowed that recovery. General tree cover has increased, and also changing practices more recently in terms of planting broadleaf woodland as well as just the conifer plantations, and those all important reintroductions that are going to hopefully provide stepping stones for pine martens to recover across the rest of Britain. So if we think about why do we want to reintroduce pine martens, I've probably covered a few of these things. We have a missing species that are particularly endangered, so there's a conservation need for the species themselves, and they play a really important role in balancing our woodland ecosystems. They have various functions within that, so I've mentioned sort of, you know, that kind of predator balance, seed dispersal being really important, and potentially grey squirrel. But also, our project isn't really operating alone at all. In fact, we are part, or hope to be part, we are part of a national strategic recovery for pine marten. So this was a piece of work that was commissioned by Natural England and Nature Scott to look at how best to see a recovery of pine marten, whether that be reintroduction or habitat improvement to allow natural sort of recolonisation. And why reintroduction? So probably touched on it a little bit there. So as part of that strategy, lots of modelling was done to look at what it would look like, what natural recolonisation would look like without and with translocations. And the speckly bits basically are where we see recovery of pine marten over 25 years, which was the period that they looked at. So this is the Vincent Wildlife Trust wrote this piece of work. who are considered the sort of national mustard experts. And you can see that image on the right with looking at the southwest being part of that recovery. So yeah, so we've got kind of major barriers really at the north of England that are going to seriously hamper the movement of animals out of Scotland, with all the urban areas and roads as well, both of which are kind of quite big risks for pine martens. So that brings us to our project, which hopefully you're fairly familiar with, if you've been following us. So we started with an initial feasibility assessment. So before you can even start thinking about anything very much, you've got to look at how feasible is this? And we have to look at a whole bunch of things. So we look at biologically, is it feasible? Is there enough habitat? Is there enough of the right habitat? Is it connected? You know, is it away from roads and sort of urban conurbations and things? And we also have to look at ecological feasibility, so what impact it might have on other species and habitats in the area. And also we have a social feasibility as well. So, you know, lack of consideration about feelings and impacts on communities is a big cause of failure in reintroduction projects around the world. So it's a really key part of the project. We had to consider disease risks as well, posed to and by any animals that we move around the country. And animal welfare is of real importance to us as well. So we're following national and global guidelines in terms of the IUCN guidelines and our own Scottish and English guides, which are gold standards for projects like these. So we've followed that initial feasibility up with a big full feasibility report, which we've just recently finished and submitted that to Natural England, with Nature Scot being involved with that. And so we're waiting to hear whether we get consent for the project. So ultimately the decision rests with our statutory bodies. So I'm going to just sort of go through a few of those things really, and processes and what we've kind of found. So one of the things, as I mentioned, was a social feasibility. This is a really key part of our consenting process. The project has been talking to landowners and local communities for over a year now. And we've had a focus on some key stakeholder workshops this year. So we've done sort of 10 of those with stakeholder groups that we've identified as people that might have concerns about reintroducing pine martens, about pine martens being back in our landscape. As part of this process, we commissioned an independent study with the University of Exeter. We did a wide-ranging public survey. I'm sure that many of you took part. And they also did a more in-depth survey with some of the volunteers from those stakeholder workshops that we did. So that was a much more kind of in-depth interview. So sort of very brief whistle stop, we had over 800 people took part in the public survey, and the response was overwhelmingly very positive with very high support. Of course, that is from the people that were, you know, took part in that survey, so we have to have that caveat. But even so, you know, that was a positive result there. The stakeholder in-depth kind of part of that survey was really interesting. We didn't actually see anything we weren't expecting come out of it. And broadly, we had kind of three perspectives that were identified. So we had one group that were generally really favourable to pine marten reintroduction and appreciated the benefits, whether that was to sort of tourism or wildlife or ecosystems or the species themselves, of course. So we had a very positive one. We had a group that was quite concerned about the reintroduction, and there were concerns about the general impacts on wildlife and potential impacts to game birds and poultry potentially. And we had a third group as well that were generally quite favourable, but they had a few conditions. You know, yes, that sounds a great idea, but we really think you should be monitoring kind of the other species that are living there, and taking into consideration some of those kind of concerns. So these findings generally concur a lot, actually. They align a lot with what's been found elsewhere. But the findings that come out of that is going to sort of shape the project as we move forward. And it's a big part of the project and a big part of how we address those concerns moving forward. So I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs, but one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're doing a series of webinars, one of which we've had already, so Living with Pine Martens, where we sort of have invited speakers to talk over some of the experiences and the reality of what it's like to live with pine martens. So this was one that the Woodland Trust, one of the project partners, organised recently, really around the sort of elements of forestry. So how does it impact squirrel control? What does it mean for someone managing woodland with pine martens moving into it, which are a protected species? And there are a lot of questions came out of that, and a lot of discussion. These are being recorded, so that one is now available if people would like to see it. So I've put my email address at the end, so do get in touch with us if you would like to see that discussion. We've got one coming up next week on the 5th of October, and that is really looking at perspectives from Wales and Scotland. So looking at personal experiences of somebody who's been involved with pine marten projects, but actually talking about how what that looked like in terms of kind of stakeholder concerns and what was done and what worked, what didn't work. We've also hopefully got a couple of people joining us as well. Someone who's a farmer from Scotland and a farmer from Wales as well, just to talk about their experiences and the people that they know. It's really just to try and get a bit of a reality check. So actually, what does this mean? And give opportunities for people who might have concerns to be able to have a proper sort of open discussion about this. So if that's something that interests you, then definitely get in touch. We're hoping to invite some other speakers and continue with this line, really hopefully invite some speakers from Scotland, give some more insights into their experiences and potentially some interesting research as well that's happening up in Scotland. So, so that was our social feasibility. The upshot of the biological element was to identify our key areas, which again, you may be familiar with. So Two Moors, so we have got two areas, one around the fringes of Exmoor and one around the fringes of Dartmoor. So these areas have been identified because they've got around 20% woodland cover, and they're where some of our bigger blocks of woodlands are in the county. And there's good connectivity within those areas as well. So although this is considered a single reintroduction, if it goes ahead, we're obviously looking at two releases in one in each of these areas. So we've got these very broad areas. So what do we do then? Well, we sat down and we did a bit of a desktop study, had a look at, okay, so what does that mean on the ground? Where are those key best areas going to be? And best practice, really, you would look at sort of core of these areas so that there's, best possibility of dispersal out from release areas, and looking at where you've got kind of good areas of woodland. So we kind of have got some rough ideas within those areas as where we consider would be suitable. And we've also had their advisors, Devon Wildlife Trust, come out and do site visits and things and have a look. And the next step really from that was to do some habitat surveys. So this is something that we've been really busy with over this summer or the last sort of 2 or 3 months. Following our stakeholder workshops, we then sort of carried out habitat surveys. So this has been a real kind of volunteer-led programme. So we did some training days, and the Woodland Trust developed an app which has been great. So all the data collection can be done on a mobile phone. There's a little screenshot there of some plots that were surveyed by our volunteers. And they were just looking at sort of basic habitat features within the woodland. You know, are there going to be opportunities for denning? So are there cavities in trees, upturned root plates? Are we seeing piles of dead brash and wood around? What sort of tree species? Are there fruiting trees? Is there fruiting ground cover? All those kind of things, just to get a feel for what these sites look like on the ground. And are they going to provide enough good habitat for a sort of new population of pine marten? Because obviously when you first, you know, release animals into a new environment, those sort of first few months and first years are really critical. So making sure that you know that these sites have everything that they need. We're looking at some prey availability surveys coming up. So I mentioned that one of the big key prey items are voles. Although that is a bank vole, we're actually going to give some vole transects, which will be primarily around field voles, just to get an idea of abundance of, you know, a key item of food. So we're looking at what we call complementary habitat as well. So although woodlands are really important, some of those adjacent scrub areas and west grassland are going to be really vital in terms of key foraging grounds for pine marten. So that's ongoing. We've got, as I say, we've got vole surveys coming up. It's quite exciting. Yeah, so the sites are all looking good. I think if we do have pine martens down here, they will be very happy pine martens. So the other areas that we had to look at was ecological impact. So as part of our feasibility report, we had to carry out a full HRA, which is a habitat regulations assessment. And that's a requirement, but also there were elements that we added in because we felt that we really wanted this to be really robust and done in the best possible way. So when we're looking at those areas, we look at European protected sites. So there were 6 special areas of conservation that we had to look at and 21 triple SIs. So a lot of work, and some of that was contracted out to specialists in those areas. So for example, bat specialists to really kind of assess potential impact that bringing pine martens back into these areas may have on some of our more vulnerable species. And just again, very brief summary. It's a big document. So there's a lot of detail in there. But one of the key sort of areas of risk tends to be around sort of man-made structures. So whether that's things like buildings and barns where we might have bat roosts and other things living there, or it could even be, in fact, things like boxes as well. And we have a number of box schemes for certain species across Devon and Somerset. I've got a couple here, so Tide flycatchers and dormice, for example, which on the continent or mainland Europe and certainly in America as well, putting anti-predator devices on all your nest boxes is fairly normal practice, but it's something that we don't really do here because we basically got rid of all our predators to a greater or lesser extent. So it's really kind of looking at some of those adaptations that are used elsewhere. We'll be trialing some to make sure they don't have adverse effects on, for example, uptake by birds, and things like dormice, really making sure that boxes are robust and the lids are wired firmly down, because the holes around the back on a dormouse box, they're pretty kind of pine marten proof as long as the boxes are in good shape. People were worried about sort of free living dormice, but we have to remember that dormice and pine martens live alongside in mainland Europe and they have co-evolved. So the chances of a pine marten coming across a dormouse is not that high, given that they're not both quite rare in the landscape. And dormice are quite well adapted to coping with predators. We had discussions with people who have done lots of research looking at, how foxes and badgers will walk straight past a hibernating dormouse on the woodland floor. So there's no reason to think that that would be much different from a pine marten. So lots of things to think about there. Some of the back to mitigation that we're looking at. So if we do get our consent, and we hope to hear about that, whether it be this side of Christmas. But if that all goes ahead, then we would be looking at starting some of these modifications in January. So these are kind of standard things, again, that have been used in previous projects, but they're also used to prevent access to buildings where there are bat roosts from things like cats, and also sometimes nesting sort of predatory birds. So, for example, birds of prey that feed on bats. So if you've got very important bat roosts, then putting some of these things in place is a sort of understood and well practiced thing to do. So got things like tip trays. So if animals try and climb in, they flip up and close the access, and slippery surfaces so that there's no purchase there. Obviously, it has to be done very carefully because we don't want to stop access to the bats. But this is all the kind of thing that we are currently looking at in terms of protecting some of the very important bat roosts that we do have in the southwest. So I guess probably one of our main socio-economic impacts really are where we have impacts to game birds and poultry, really. So again, this is something, so these are some Irish guidelines. So as pine martens have recovered across Ireland, Vincent Wildlife Trust have done a lot of work with all sorts of people there to develop kind of practical ways to exclude pine martens from game and poultry pens. They are, as I mentioned, they can climb trees. You have to bear that in mind. But if you have fairly robust protection against predators like foxes, you're quite a long way there already. But we are looking at other ideas, how to make some of these precautions, some of these protections a little bit more practical for people. And we're looking also at some other possible ideas that are coming out of some research in Scotland, but you might have to tune into one of our webinars to hear a bit more about that. So these are ongoing conversations that we're having with people around this. And it's a piece of work that we're just about to start, is trying to look at how we roll out a comprehensive sort of plan for mitigation around these areas. The other thing I mentioned was the disease concern, and that has come up quite a lot in our discussions with stakeholders, especially around things like bovine TB and avian flu. So a full disease risk assessment was carried out by the Zoological Society of London. They do these quite regularly for a whole range of species, and they assess disease risk to the animal, from the animal. They look at where it's coming from, how it's going to be transported into the new areas, how that release is going to happen, and what kind of hazards may be presented along that way. And I think it was something like about 16 assessed hazards, which included bovine TB, because we did have people mention that, but it would have been done anyway. And new strains of avian flu as well, which obviously have developed since they last looked at this process with the Forested Green project in Gloucestershire. A lot of it's due to the sort of biology of the species, but a number of other factors as well. So the risks for all of these things were low, some of them very low, but mitigations have been suggested as sort of precautionary measures. And they're also drawing up sort of protocol for post-release health screening as well. So it's all belt and braces stuff. So what next? So a lot of this obviously would depend on our consenting. So if all goes to plan, we would be looking at a release of animals this time next year. So national guidance says that only animals from Scotland should be considered. They're the best genetic and ecological match for our habitats. I've put a little orange line on there. So that is actually the grey squirrel demarcation line. So grey squirrels have spread throughout most of Britain, but haven't quite got into the top of Scotland yet. And that's where we still have a good thriving populations of red squirrels. And because of this sort of interest and potential impact of pine martens on grey squirrels, we're not allowed to take pine martens from below that line because partly a research element, so they really want to kind of see what that impact is. But obviously, if they are impacting, then we don't want to be taking animals away. And also because the further south we go, the more it's a recovering population. So it's potentially not quite so many animals available. So Scottish animals to come down to the southwest, as I mentioned, with the first release this time next year and a follow up the year after. And so we'd be looking at between sort of 40 to 50 animals in total for those. The idea is that those two populations or those two releases will eventually will spread, the animals from those will breed and spread, and eventually they'll kind of meet up, as it were, and form more meta-population, with the ultimate aim, as I mentioned, to link into animals that are already spreading out from the Welsh and Forest of Dean projects. So what would that look like on the ground? So these are some pictures from the Forest of Dean project in Gloucestershire, so courtesy of Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. These are their photos. So we do what's called a soft release. So that means well, it's a whole bunch of work needs to happen in Scotland first. So lots of work up there in terms of surveys to make sure that we're taking animals from places where there are enough to support taking out a few animals. Also consulting the local communities up there. A lot of people are very keen on their pine martens. People feed them in their gardens, have names for them. So we need to be kind of quite sensitive around that as well. And then when the animals, they're trapped up there, they'll have radio collars placed on them so that we can track them and know where they're going. We can see how they disperse in the landscape. We can see where they're starting to set up territories, which is going to be really, really important when it comes to talking to some of the more concerned landowners who actually have a really good idea where those animals are, certainly for the first year. So they come down and we build these release pens. So these are temporary pens out in the woods, and individual animals put in these. So they're going in their ones, we put them together. And we have to space them quite far apart. So I mentioned they're very territorial. So we'll have sort of pairs of release pens that have to be at least 2 kilometres away from the next pair and things like that. And they stay in those only for about 3 days until they're considered to sort of their stress levels from transport as lowered, and they'll be fed and monitored throughout that whole process. And then the doors get opened, and usually they go pretty much. Not many of them have ever come back to carry on taking food, but we will carry on feeding them just to make sure and keep monitoring them with camera traps. And then at that point, they're then out in the wilds, and we'll have a whole team of people radio tracking, and then also going back to Scotland to get the next report. We can only do them in sort of small numbers at a time, for practical sort of reasons, really. So that's the kind of process. If you're familiar with reintroductions of a lot of mammals, this is quite a standard kind of thing. So they're allowed to acclimatise in a protected environment before they go out. Once they're out in the landscape, then follow-up surveys. So beyond that sort of initial radio tracking, as time goes by and the radio collars fall off, we'll be relying on things like scat surveys. So this is JC, who part of the Forest of Dean project, looking for scats. So scats are pine marten poop, quite characteristic in terms of their smell, I'm told. I've only found one, so I'm not, can't speak from a wide range of experience in that department, but I'm sure it asked me in a couple of years' time and that will change. So we can look at scat surveys and also things like camera trap surveys. So putting camera traps out where we can put bait out. So pine martens love a jam sandwich or peanuts and an egg they particularly like. So you can put bait out and put cameras out. And that's a really good way of getting actual tangible evidence that there's a pine marten out there. The scats can be quite tricky. They're easily confused with fox scats and other things as well. So we'll be looking for plenty of volunteers down the line. If we get to this point, it's going to be reliant on a lot of people out there doing some camera tracking, scat surveys, and all sorts of things. So I'm aware that I'm at my 45 minutes. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have any questions. I put my email address at the bottom there. So do email me if you're interested in any of those webinars come out. They are for landowners, so I would stress that that's who they're directed at. And so we do tend to sort of prioritise people that have particular kind of questions or areas where they're concerned. So that's really kind of targeted at you guys if you're on the school. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think, and we might get to see Steve again.
Thank you, Tracey. That was really fascinating. And if I didn't know already, I do know how involved a process it is to get pine martens back into the landscape of Devon and the wider southwest. We have had some questions, you'll be glad to know. And in no particular order, I'll kick off with this question that comes in. It says, when will the first releases take place? And I think the second part of that questioner's point is, why not link the two release areas together? Why not have one, I suppose, meta release site rather than having two ones isolated from each other?
Okay, so if we get our consent, as I mentioned, the first release would be around this time next year, with the subsequent one the year after. We could have done one release and done sort of a first release in the same place, followed by a kind of top up or a second release. But actually, a lot of that modelling work that was done as part of that initial feasibility study by Devon Wildlife Trust, they looked at various scenarios and looked at the most successful options. So looking at the dispersal rates of pine martens and various kind of characteristics about their biology. Was it going to be best to do one area or two different ones, with the idea that they would eventually join? And that one, in terms of the modelling, came out as definitely the more successful route. Also, from a practical point of view, it's probably a bit easier to manage, possibly. The Welsh project did one release area, so they did a second release into the same area, and they found that the second release, the animals from the second release travelled a lot further, probably because there were already pine martens setting up territory in that initial release area. So they ended up moving, much further away to find their own territory. So they do travel in the landscape a long way to look for space, really. So actually spreading them out will help with that too.
Okay, thank you. Someone else asks, what would a healthy size of pine marten population be in the future? Have you got a goal that we're working towards?
I'm a bit worried this is being recorded because I'm trying to remember. We did a bit of a rough estimate on what that might look like. I think it was something like 300 animals across the southwest. We have to bear in mind that we have habitat that is not suitable. Pine martens don't like open farmland and open moorlands, so they're not going to kind of go out into some of those areas. But we are absolutely sure that there is enough good connected habitat to support a fully functioning population of animals, and especially if they are, as I mentioned, able to sort of disperse sort of eastwards and meet up with the sort of forest of Dean animals as well. So that's only going to add to the sort of robustness of that sort of meta population.
And someone else asked, I mean, you showed a slide which showed how long it would take for the Scottish population to come this far southwest, but given that there's been releases in the Forest of Dean and then the New Forest, doesn't that mean that those populations would more quickly spread to the southwest?
Okay, so they would appear before the Scottish ones for sure. We have got some major landscape kind of hurdles for them to overcome. So things like big motorways, Bristol, big urban conurbations and things like Somerset levels. So there are sort of habitat areas that are not very suitable. Eventually, potentially, they could do it, but we're talking a long time and no certainty of that. And as I mentioned, we have a really small population of pine marten in the UK. So as part of kind of looking at a strategy for their recovery, these kind of interventions, if you like, are critical to give them those stepping stones. For other places, for sure, if it's looking likely they're going to get there under their own steam. So, for example, there's a project in Yorkshire where they're just monitoring. They're seeing increasing sightings up there as they're starting to sort of filter down into some of the northern counties. But down here, we're a long way from that.
Okay, thank you. Someone else asked, is there scope for a breeding program here in the southwest eventually? I suppose they're perhaps mindful of the risks, the costs of translocation from Scotland.
In terms of captive breeding, or?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, is that a possibility in the future? And could the southwest in turn see perhaps other releases elsewhere in the country?
I mean, I think in terms of if we're successful and we have a population developing down here, it would be a very, very long time before it was at a point where you could think of taking any of those animals out to anywhere else. When we looked at where animals might come from, captive populations, was an option. I don't think that we're in a position in this country at the moment to roll things like that out, but it's certainly something to look at, and they could be quite useful as additional animals potentially. I mean, that's really for sort of others to make those kind of decisions down the line. But yeah, we looked at a whole variety of options, whether we looked at mainland Europe or Ireland and things, and Scotland always came back as the most well adapted and ecologically well matched, as well as genetically well matched animals. So that's basically our best chance of success, is to use the best option that we can.
And someone else has asked, Tracey, how mature are the other pine marten reintroduction projects that you I mean, you mentioned others, Forest of Dean and Mid Wales as well. And so how old are they, and what have been the main learning points for you doing this reintroduction?
Okay, that's a really good question, actually. So the Welsh project was around 2015-16 sort of time, and the Forest of Dean, I'm trying to remember, that's more recent, 2019. I think their last release was, if I've got that wrong, I apologise, but it's roughly around those kind of times. I mean, back in my previous role, before I joined DWT, I was really well aware of the Welsh project and had quite a lot of discussions about the sort of nature of the project. It was a really well regarded and well run project. We've learned an awful lot from it. I think we're really lucky in that we're following quite a well-trodden path in terms of looking at, you know, what worked for them and what didn't work for them, and send Forest of Dean. Some of that was in terms of things like just little things like how many days they need to stay in those release pens before they go out, whether we do one release or whether we have a second release in the same place. A lot of learning around kind of stakeholders as well. I mean, that element was a big part of both of those projects. And hopefully this webinar session that we've got next week will really give out a lot of details. So I think we're going to learn quite a lot about that from them. It's all about keeping those conversations going and listening to people. We've got a lot of work to do in that regard, and we know that we have. And just being kind of aware of people's concerns and being somewhere that people can come to for support or advice or whatever it might be. So keeping the lines of communication open. And also we're starting to get an idea now of the sort of longer term impacts, or not impacts, particularly on some of the other wildlife really. So, but again, it's sort of early days with that, but all the kind of preliminary signs really are that pine martens have merged into those landscapes, so they're doing their thing, and you know it's been very successful. So yes, lots of learning from those.
Thank you. I think we're at 7 o'clock. I'm conscious of that, so we've got probably just time for one more question. Someone asked, what are the biggest objections to the reintroduction so far, and how will you overcome or mitigate them? I think you have touched upon some of the.
Yes, that's a good question to end on, isn't it? So overwhelmingly, so we did 8 stakeholder workshops as well as some drop-in sessions, and after about the 3rd one, we weren't really hearing anything new. So we were getting the same kind of messages. So we know that they're kind of valid concerns from several people. One of the big ones was impact on wildlife. You know, we have you know, a lot to think about in Devon. We have some amazing wildlife. We're strongholds for certain species, and people are quite worried about the impact of bringing another predator into that system. With a sort of slightly concerned view that you're sort of mounding up predators somehow that's going to eat everything, which is not really how it works at all. It's quite a complex ecological process. But actually, a key part of that was doing our entire ecological impact assessment, which was a huge bit of work that has to assess impact at a population level on a whole range of species and habitats, actually, although that was fairly early screened out as pine martens are not really going to impact sensitive habitats at all. They may well have beneficial effects through things like predation of grey squirrels or some of the corvid predation. So that was a very big comprehensive bit of work. I would say that when down the line, the plan is that all of these documents that have been written and worked on will all be available publicly, so they will all be on our website. But we're not going to do that until we're through this process, because at the moment, until Natural England give us a decision, they're kind of draft documents. So when everything's kind of finalised, and if we get our consent, then we'll be able to read all about all this stuff to your heart's content. The other elements, as I mentioned, were things like around game birds. So that's predation of just the young game birds, mainly when they're in the pens before the pheasants. This is pheasants mainly, before they get released into the wider landscape. And that's something that we're, as I say, we're sort of going to actually go back to some of the people that developed some of the guidelines in Ireland, actually, who've got some sort of more practical solutions, especially for smaller operations, which I think is probably where one of our risk areas is going to be. Some of the small sort of syndicate shoots or backyard poultry guys, but that's again it's on our list of definitely to-dos. And people worried around forestry operations, what are the implications of having a protected species on site for things like controlling great squirrels and doing large felling operations. And again, that's what that webinar with interest was about, but equally we'll be following up on that as well, and looking at how people manage that in other areas, where there are things like red squirrels, you know, you have those kind of issues, and people have ways around that. So it's kind of learning from other places.
Okay, thank you, Tracey. Thanks very much. I mean, really interesting and engaging talk. We had more than 350 people sign up for this talk.
Oh,
So I
wow.
think it shows the interest, the passions that the subjects like this elicit. So thank you to you for this evening, and thank you to everyone who's attended this meeting. If you're interested in the events that we run at Devon Wildlife Trust, then please look at our website. You'll find lots more. We run over 100 events every year, most of which are free to attend, many of which are online. And indeed, next month, I think in November, there's a talk on wildcat reintroduction. So that might be another thing that you might like to attend. So sign up on via our website. And if you're interested in our charity's work, then please also think about supporting us either via the website or if you're stopped in the street by one of our recruiters. Think kindly about us and the work that people like Tracey are doing. So thanks very much and good night.